The classification stamp was still warm when Archivist Prime Velun pressed it into the seal. Not metaphorically warm, physically warm. The thermal ink used by the Conclave's Harmless Designation Bureau required exactly 4.2 seconds of friction activation before bonding to the official record. Velun had pressed thousands of these stamps across a career spanning 9 decades of galactic bureaucracy. The warmth was routine, expected, unremarkable. What was not routine was the smell. Something in the air of the processing chamber had changed. A faint chemical trace, organic in origin, sharp at the edges, the kind of molecular signature that Velun's secondary olfactory cluster registered as asterisk burning. Not the burning of fire, the burning of something under pressure, something that had been compressed for a very long time. Velun looked at the sealed record. Species designation, human. Classification, harmless. Threat index, 0.003. Recommended action, passive observation, no intervention required. The stamp was already bonded. The record was already filed. The case was already closed. Velun did not know what that smell meant. Later, much later, when the Conclave's emergency session convened to discuss what had happened to the Directorate fleet, what had happened to the Sovereignty Compact, what had happened to the entity humans called the Pale Architect, and what had happened to the 14 star systems that now bore the scars of something the Conclave's oldest war historians refused to categorize as a conflict asterisk. Later, when all of that was being processed, an archivist with a secondary olfactory cluster would submit a quiet report noting that the smell recorded in Processing Chamber 9 on the day of humanity's classification had been subsequently identified. It was the chemical signature of a very specific reaction. The smell of something ancient recognizing a predator. The records didn't know what to do with that. Neither did anyone else. The first human guildmaster Orath 7 of 9 ever encountered in any meaningful capacity was not a soldier, not a scientist, not a diplomat, which would have at least made taxonomic sense given that Orath's entire professional existence revolved around species contact negotiation for the Conclave's Outer Reach Expansion Directorate. The first human Orath encountered was a maintenance technician named Elena Vasquez, and she was underneath a conduit relay on Waystation Cathara Provisional, bleeding from her left hand, whistling something that Orath's translation matrix identified as a tune but could not semantically classify because it carried no information. "You are injured," Orath said. It was not a greeting. It was an observation because Orath had learned that beginning interactions with species below Tier 4 civilization rankings with direct declarative statements produced faster cognitive engagement than questions. Elena Vasquez slid partway out from under the conduit. She looked at her hand. She looked at Orath, all 4 meters of chitin and bureaucratic sash and compound eyes that registered Orath as a senior conclave official approximately 0.3 seconds before any reasonable being should have been able to process the visual data. "Yeah," she said, "happens." Then she slid back under the conduit. Orath stood in the corridor for what it later calculated to be 11 seconds, an eternity for a being whose cognitive processing cycle ran at approximately 400 subjective seconds per standard second, trying to determine what Elena Vasquez had meant. "Happens. The injury happens. Injuries do not simply happen. Injuries are outcomes of failed safety protocols, material degradation, miscalculated tolerances. Injuries are failures, and failures are categorized, reported, analyzed, and corrected so they do not asterisk happen again. Unless the human had not categorized the injury as a failure. Unless the human had categorized the injury as. The whistling continued, tuneless, information-free, apparently disconnected from the blood that was dripping at a steady 1.3 milliliter per second rate onto the station floor. "Harmless," the classification said. Oreth returned to its office and began, for the first time in 9 decades of professional service, writing a personal notation that was not part of any official record. There is something I do not understand about these creatures. I am not certain the classification captures everything relevant. What the Conclave understood about humans at the time of classification could be summarized in 4 data points. The summary was accurate. The summary was also catastrophically incomplete, in the way that describing a star as a warm light source is technically accurate. First, humans were biological, carbon-based, and operated within standard Tier 3 physiological parameters. Their homeworld was geologically active, their atmosphere was chemically aggressive by galactic norms, and their average lifespan was short enough that Conclave archivists initially assumed the species must reproduce at plague rates to maintain viable population numbers. They did not, which was the first mystery. A species that short-lived, that fragile-bodied, that biologically unimpressive, should not have survived long enough to achieve space travel. The math didn't work. Second, humans had achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 60 standard years prior to classification. 60 years. The Conclave's own developmental history suggested that the average civilization required between 800 and 2,400 years between first atomic application and viable FTL technology. Humans had accomplished this in a timeframe that the Conclave's developmental models classified as a statistical anomaly, so extreme it had initially been flagged as a data entry error. The error check came back clean. Nobody asked the obvious follow-up question. That was the second mystery, though nobody recognized it as one. Not why humans had developed FTL so fast, but what had been happening during those 60 years that produced the engineers who built it. Third, humans demonstrated no measurable psionic capacity, no biological weapons capability, no colonial military presence, and a political structure so fragmented that 6 different human factions had submitted competing first contact applications to the Conclave within the same solar rotation. This was interpreted as weakness, disorganization, evidence of a species that had not yet finished the internal unification process that preceded genuine galactic citizenship. Fourth, and this was the data point that anchored the Harmless classification more than anything else, humans surrendered. In every single recorded first contact military encounter prior to classification, when a Conclave vessel or affiliated species vessel had made a show of force, humans had backed down. Every time. Without exception. Their vessels had powered down weapons systems, broadcasting submission signals, retreating to what their communications described as diplomatic resolution channels. Every time. The Conclave read this as cowardice, as rational self-preservation in the face of obviously superior force, as confirmation that humans understood their own limitations. Oreth 7 of 9, reading through the contact logs in its personal office on the night before it filed its 3rd quarterly report on human behavior, stopped at the surrender records, read them again, then sat very still for a long time. They surrendered every time, Oreth said aloud to no one. Every time. Not asterisk, usually asterisk. Not most of the time asterisk. Not when they calculated the odds as unfavorable. Every encounter, every show of force. Immediate, total submission. Oreth pulled up the behavioral probability matrices for species-level submission behavior, cross-referenced with known species profiles. The matrix was clear. Species that submitted universally, without calculation, fell into one of 2 categories. Either they were genuinely incapable of resistance and had survived through ecological luck, or they were waiting for something. What, Oreth said quietly, are you waiting for? The notation file opened. 3 words were added. I think they're calculating. The pale architect first noticed humanity through an economic report. This was fitting. The Pale Architect noticed most things through economic reports. It had built an empire. The word was insufficient, but no better one existed. Across 11 star systems by understanding a truth that older, softer civilizations refused to accept. That all conflict was ultimately resource competition in disguise, and that the species which controlled resource access controlled everything else. The Pale Architect was not a Conclave member. It operated in what diplomatic language called the asterisk outer sovereignty, compact asterisk, a collection of species and territories that had declined Conclave affiliation for various reasons that all reduced, when pressed, to the same reason. They did not wish to be regulated. The economic report that brought humanity to the Pale Architect's attention concerned the Cathara way station network. Specifically, it concerned the fact that human maintenance crews had, over a period of approximately 4 years, quietly made themselves indispensable to roughly 40% of the network's operational infrastructure. Not through contracts, not through competitive bidding, by simply being the crews that showed up, stayed when conditions deteriorated, fixed things the contracted crews had declared unfixable, and charged rates low enough that station managers stopped asking questions about how they were doing it. The Pale Architect read this report and felt something its species called asterisk recognition asterisk, a resonance between observed behavior and previously held strategic understanding. It sent an emissary to way station Cathara Provisional. The emissary's name was not important. What was important was the conversation the emissary had with the human station operations coordinator, a 43-year-old man named Director of Operations Marcus Hale, in a small room that smelled of recycled air and something the emissary could not identify. "Your crews have been operating at a loss on this network for 31 months, the emissary said. Marcus Hale looked up from his screen. That a question? An observation. Then you're right. Why? Marcus Hale set down his tablet. He had the kind of face that had spent a significant portion of its existence outdoors on a planet that did not particularly care about facial preservation. He looked at the emissary the way someone looks at a door they are about to open without knowing what's on the other side. Because, he said, the station needed the work done, and we could do it. At a loss. For now. The emissary reported back to the Pale Architect that the humans on Cathara were operating on a long-term economic strategy of infrastructure dependency creation, textbook resource competition. The Pale Architect was pleased. It understood resource competition. It knew exactly how to respond to resource competition. What neither the emissary nor the Pale Architect understood was what Marcus Hale had not said. What Marcus Hale had not said was, because 6 of my crew members have kids on this station now, and another 4 fell in love here, and 2 of them are buried in the Section 7 memorial because a pressure seal failed 3 years ago, and they went into the breach to pull out the Catharan children who were on a school tour. And so this station is ours now in a way that has nothing to do with economics. The Pale Architect sent its initial pressure team to Cathara 9 months later. Elena Vasquez was the one who answered the door. She was still whistling. Here is what happened at Cathara, according to the official Conclave incident record, filed 40 days after the fact. A Sovereignty Compact pressure vessel, classification, heavy enforcer, crew complement 340, armament sufficient to compel compliance from a non-military way station, arrived at Cathara Provisional and transmitted a standard compact economic compliance demand. Surrender of infrastructure contracts, transfer of operational control, human crews to vacate within 72 hours. Standard procedure. The compact had executed this protocol 847 times across the outer reach. The success rate was 847 out of 847. The human crew did not comply. The pressure vessel's commander, a being called the Voice of Appropriate Consequence, which was a title rather than a name, because the compact had decided that the beings who delivered economic ultimatums should carry titles rather than names to make the process feel more like weather than violence, transmitted a second demand, with a 12-hour deadline and a visual demonstration of the vessel's primary weapons, array powering to active. The human crew did not comply. The voice of appropriate consequence escalated to final warning protocol. This involved targeting the station's primary habitat ring with active weapons lock, an action that the compact's behavioral modeling predicted would produce immediate and unconditional human surrender based on every previous human contact record on file. Elena Vasquez opened a communication channel. The voice of appropriate consequence prepared to receive a surrender. "Here's the thing," Elena Vasquez said. She had the kind of voice that made you feel like you were being told something very simple by someone who had decided, somewhere before this conversation began, that they were not going to perform patience anymore. "You pointed your guns at our habitat ring." "Correct. Where the children are." A pause. "Compliance will ensure no harm." "You pointed your guns at where our children are." The communication channel was quiet for 2.3 seconds. In the behavioral record that the Conclave later reconstructed from station logs, 2.3 seconds was the period during which Elena Vasquez's biometric readings, captured by the station's medical monitoring system, showed something that the Conclave's xenopsychology division spent 4 months trying to categorize. Her heart rate decreased. Not spiked, decreased. From 78 beats per standard minute to 61. In the 2.3 seconds after the voice of appropriate consequence confirmed that yes, the weapons were locked on the habitat ring. The voice of appropriate consequence did not know what a decreasing heart rate meant. It had been designed to read the proxies of fear, submission signals, communication delay, biosign elevation, not whatever was happening in Elena Vasquez's chest. "We're not complying," Elena Vasquez said, "and I need you to understand something before you make the next decision. I need you to understand it very clearly." "You will. We know you can destroy this station," she said. "We've known that since you docked in our sensor range. We've known that the whole time. It was never a question of whether you could." The voice of appropriate consequence waited. "The question," Elena Vasquez said, "is what happens after." The pressure vessel did not fire. The Conclave's official incident record notes that the pressure vessel departed Cathara provisional space 14 hours later, without engaging, without achieving compliance, without explanation. The record classifies this as an asterisk operational withdrawal for undisclosed strategic reassessment. The record does not note what the voice of appropriate consequence transmitted to the Pale Architect during those 14 hours. That transmission was recovered 18 months later, during the investigation, and it contained one line that had been sent, and then immediately flagged for redaction by the commander before the full report was filed. "They are not afraid of us. They are angry that we pointed weapons at their young. These are not the same state, and I do not know how to proceed." Here is where the official record ends and something else begins. Because everything above, the classification, the Cathara incident, the Pale Architect's miscalculation, Elena Vasquez's heart rate, had been observed, cataloged, and filed as data, as information about a Tier 3 species exhibiting unusual but manageable behavioral anomalies. What none of those records captured, what no Conclave observer had access to, what no economic report could quantify, was what humans were doing in private. Orath 7 of 9 discovered this by accident. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days after the Cathara incident. Buried in a data transfer authorization request that came through routine Conclave processing and should have taken Orath approximately 12 seconds to approve and forward. Orath did not approve it in 12 seconds. Orath stopped. The request was from a human cultural institution, a museum. The data being transferred was described as *historical records*, specifically, a collection of accounts from the period between humanity's first atomic application and their development of FTL technology. The 60 years that the Conclave's developmental models had flagged as a statistical anomaly. The filing was routine. Museums transferred historical records constantly. There was no reason to examine the contents. But the destination code was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Wrong in the way that a weight is wrong when something has been removed from it without adjustment. A ghost variance. A number that was correct in every digit but incorrect in its context. The destination was listed as a Tier 2 archival repository, a location that should not have had the access credentials to receive this specific data package. Because the credentials being used belonged to an institution that had been dissolved 14 years earlier. Somebody was routing data through a ghost credential. To understand why that mattered, it was necessary to understand something about Conclave data architecture that Oreth had spent 9 decades inside without ever considering politically. The Conclave's passive observation monitoring for harmless classified species was linked to archival transfer records. It was a budget measure. Rather than maintaining a separate observation infrastructure for species the Conclave had no strategic interest in, the monitoring passively piggybacked on communication and data flows, logging metadata without accessing content. Routing through a ghost credential broke the passive monitoring chain. Oreth stared at the filing, then pulled the last 4 years of human cultural transfer requests. Every single one had a ghost credential destination. Every single one had been sitting in plain sight, authorized by automated processing, unread by any conscious Conclave administrator, because they were museum transfers. Historical records. Who examines historical records? What have you been sending? Oreth whispered. And where has it been going? The answer, when Oreth finally accessed the content of those transfers through a chain of authorization escalations that took 11 days and involved waking up 3 senior Conclave officials who had not been woken for non-emergency matters in decades. The answer rewrote everything. The content was not historical records in any sense the Conclave would have recognized. It was operational documentation, formatted as history, written as if describing events that had already occurred, but the dates in the documentation had not yet arrived. Humans had not been sending cultural archives. Humans had been sending plans, formatted as completed historical accounts of events that had not happened yet, routed through a filing system that the Conclave's monitoring treated as background noise, distributed to coordinates that only resolved to locations when you cross-referenced them against the human settlement maps that had been quietly, steadily expanding across the outer reach for 4 years. The Conclave had classified humans as harmless, and then, with all the institutional thoroughness of a civilization that had been doing this for 10,000 years, had stopped watching closely. Humans had been talking to each other, constantly, at a volume and a depth, and with a coordination that the Conclave's passive monitoring had summarized as *routine cultural exchange, because that was what it looked like from the outside. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Oreth sat in the office where the notation file had been growing for 3 years, opened it, added a single line below the existing entries. They were never surrendering. They were waiting until they were ready. Then Oreth did something that 9 decades of Conclave training said never to do without multi-division consultation and a formal impact assessment. Oreth sent an emergency alert directly to the Security Council. The message was 7 words. Pull the human classification, pull it now. The Security Council did not respond for 6 hours because emergency alerts from archivists were not, in the Security Council's procedural hierarchy, actually emergencies. They were urgent administrative concerns that required a minimum 2-division verification request before formal Security Council engagement. Those 6 hours mattered. The Pale Architect moved first. Not because the Pale Architect had read Orath's alert. It hadn't, because the Pale Architect was not part of the Conclave's internal communication architecture. The Pale Architect moved first because the Pale Architect had spent 3 years being increasingly irritated by the Cathara situation, and by the subsequent 15 situations across the outer reach that had followed the same pattern, and because the Pale Architect had a philosophy about irritants. You removed them decisively before they became something else. The Pale Architect sent not a pressure vessel this time. It sent a fleet designation that the Compact called the Instrument of Correction 14 vessels, a combined crew of roughly 4,200, armament sufficient to compel compliance from a minor colony, which was what human presence in the outer reach amounted to. A minor colony, a Tier 3 species with a few waystation contracts and a persistent refusal to take economic direction. The Instrument of Correction arrived at the primary human outer reach settlement, a waystation and colony hybrid called Threshold, and transmitted its compliance demand. Marcus Hale received the transmission. He was sitting in the same chair where he'd spoken to the Pale Architect's emissary 3 years earlier. The recycled air smell was still there. Elena Vasquez was standing to his left, which was where she always stood when things were happening. He read the demand, the timeline, the consequences of noncompliance, which were described in the kind of bloodless institutional language that made violence sound like weather. He set the transmission down. "Okay," he said. Elena Vasquez said nothing. "Initiate the coordination protocol," Marcus Hale said. "All nodes." "Already running," she said. "Has been since their fleet hit our sensor perimeter." Marcus Hale looked at the timeline in the demand. 72 hours to full compliance. He picked up a pen, an actual physical pen, which had no business existing on a waystation that was theoretically a paperless operational environment. But Marcus Hale carried a pen because he'd been carrying pens since he was 7 years old and he didn't see any reason to stop, and made a small mark on his desk. "Tell Vasquez 7 to go to secondary," he said. "She's already at secondary," Elena said, "and tertiary, she decided not to wait." Marcus Hale looked up. "Did she?" "She told the relay crew, if they point anything at the children, we skip the waiting part." Something moved across Marcus Hale's face that was not a smile and was not fury and was not quite sorrow. It was the expression of someone who has calculated, privately, the full cost of what they are doing, and has paid it in advance in the quiet without asking anyone's permission. "Good," he said. "The Conclave's recovered records of the next 72 hours exist in fragments. Not because they were destroyed, they weren't, but because the events they documented moved faster than any single recording system could track, occurred simultaneously across 11 locations, and involved human coordination so rapid and so layered that the Conclave's intelligence reconstruction team spent 18 months producing a timeline that was still, by their own admission, almost certainly missing significant elements. Here is what can be confirmed. The Instrument of Correction's compliance deadline was 72 hours. At hour 8, 3 of its 14 vessels detected that their communication frequencies were being mirrored, not jammed, mirrored. Every signal they broadcast was being exactly replicated from a source that the vessels could not locate, meaning that the Compact's command coordination signals were being received simultaneously by the intended vessel and by whoever was running the mirror operation. The vessels could not tell which replies they received were from their own command structure and which were synthetic. The Instrument of Correction's operational protocol for communication compromise was to go to secondary encryption. They went to secondary. The mirroring followed them to secondary. At hour 19, 2 compact vessels that had been dispatched to locate the mirror operation source reported contact with human vessels that were not in any registry the compact held. Not in any registry the Conclave held. Vessels that had not, as far as anyone could determine, existed 3 years ago. They did not fire. They broadcast on open channels, the kind of broadcast that any receiver in range could pick up, and what they broadcast was a list of names. Long lists. Formatted as something between an inventory and a memorial. The compact vessels did not understand what they were receiving. They reported it to the Instrument of Correction's command vessel. The command vessel's communications officer spent 40 minutes trying to decode what kind of strategic communication the name lists represented. They were not strategic communications. They were the names of every human who had died in the outer reach over the previous 60 years, broadcast on open frequency, so that whoever came next would know who had been here first. At hour 31, the Pale Architect's direct representative aboard the command vessel, a being called the Second Voice. Present specifically because the Pale Architect had decided this compliance operation was important enough to warrant direct oversight, requested an urgent private communication with Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale accepted. "You're going to lose your station," the Second Voice said. It was not a threat. It was an assessment delivered with what sounded almost like professional regret. "We have sufficient force. We have sufficient will. Whatever you are attempting with the communications interference, we will adapt. You should know this." Marcus Hale was quiet for a moment. "How many of your crew members," he said, "have children on this station?" "None," the Second Voice said, the word carrying the implication that the question was not relevant. "Right," Marcus Hale said, "that's the difference. That changes nothing about the force calculation." "I know," Marcus Hale said. "We're not fighting your force calculation. We're not even fighting you." The Second Voice waited. "We're fighting the idea," Marcus Hale said, "that you get to make this call about a place where our people are buried." The Second Voice later filed a report that the Pale Architect marked as the single most confusing intelligence assessment it had received in 4 decades of strategic operations. The report's conclusion section contained this line: "I do not believe the human leader was describing strategy. I believe he was describing a property of the humans themselves. I do not know what to do with that." Hour 47. This is where the Conclave's recovered record becomes fragmented, because hour 47 is when the Human Coordination Protocol, the one that had been running since the Instrument of Correction hit sensor perimeter, executed its final phase. What the Pale Architect had understood was that humans had been building infrastructure dependency across 40% of the Cathara network. What the Pale Architect had not understood, what nobody outside the Human Coordination Network had understood, because the plans had been formatted as historical records and routed through ghost credentials and discussed in 47 languages across 11 way station communities in a constant rolling conversation that the Conclave's monitoring had summarized as *routine cultural exchange*, was that the infrastructure dependency worked in both directions. Every system the compact operated in the outer reach that had, at any point in the previous 4 years, allowed a human maintenance crew to perform a service call had a ghost in it. Not malware, not a virus, something that had no name in compact security architecture, because the compact security architecture had been written by beings who built systems with the assumption that maintenance access meant maintenance. Humans, it turned out, did not distinguish between maintenance and ownership. When you fixed something, the human's apparent philosophy ran, it was yours. 11 compact vessels experienced simultaneous navigational system anomalies, not catastrophic failures. The systems continued to function, but they began making small, persistent navigational suggestions that, if followed, would bring the affected vessels to coordinates that were not where they were supposed to be. The anomalies were repairable, individually. Each one, by itself, was a minor technical issue that any competent engineer could address in 4 to 6 hours. All 11 vessels had the anomaly simultaneously. The instrument of correction had 4 engineers qualified to perform the repair. 4 engineers, 11 vessels. The math was not difficult. The Pale Architect's fleet was not disabled. It was slowed. For exactly long enough. Orath 7 of 9's emergency alert reached the Security Council at hour 6. The Security Council's verification request was completed, and the alert escalated to emergency status at hour 22. The Security Council convened at hour 29. At hour 31, the same hour the second voice was asking Marcus Hale about force calculations. The Security Council voted to dispatch a Conclave diplomatic intervention vessel to the threshold situation. The vessel arrived at hour 59. The instrument of correction was still there, still functional, still, technically, in compliance operation. But in the 12 hours between the navigational anomalies beginning and the Conclave vessel arriving, something had changed in the compact fleet's operational posture that the Conclave's arrival assessment couldn't fully articulate. The fleet was positioned correctly. Weapons were active. The compliance deadline had been extended twice, operational necessity, the official reason, but the force was present. It simply had not moved. The Conclave diplomat, a senior adjudicator named Marin Bright Clarity, who had negotiated 16 interstellar compliance disputes, and whose professional record was defined by an almost supernatural ability to identify the precise moment that force of will, rather than force of arms, was determining an outcome, transmitted to Marcus Hale. "I need to understand what you're doing," Marin said. "Staying," Marcus Hale said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Marin sat with that. Then, "The compact fleet has not withdrawn. You have not achieved a military victory. You cannot hold this position indefinitely." "I know." "Then what?" "We don't need to hold it indefinitely," Marcus Hale said. "We need to hold it long enough for everyone who's watching to understand what holding it cost us, and then they'll know what we're willing to pay." Marin Bright Clarity had been in interstellar negotiation for 60 years. She had never heard a force doctrine articulated in those terms. She requested clarification. "You're using yourself as a demonstration," she said, "not a question." "We're using threshold," Marcus Hale said. "We're using everyone who's dug in here. Yeah, because if we back down now, if one show of force is enough, then every human community in the outer reaches a target forever. But if we hold here, if it costs what it's going to cost, and we hold anyway." He stopped. Started again, with the quiet of someone saying something they have said to themselves many times in private. Then the math changes. Then the question isn't asterisk, can we be forced to leave? The question is asterisk, is it worth what it costs to make them leave? You believe the cost-benefit changes. "I believe," Marcus Hale said, "that we are very, very good at making ourselves not worth the cost." Elena Vasquez, standing off-frame, added, "We've had practice." The Conclave's diplomatic record notes that Marin Bright Clarity went off communication for approximately 17 minutes after this exchange. The record does not note what Marin was doing during those 17 minutes. The recovered personal log indicates she was reading the 60-year historical records that Orath 7 of 9 had flagged, the ones formatted as history about the future. She read enough of them to understand what the humans had been planning, and when they had started planning it, and how they had distributed those plans, and how they had done all of it in plain sight, inside the communication architecture of the most sophisticated monitoring civilization in the known galaxy, hiding nothing except the nature of what was being communicated. "When did you start this?" Marin transmitted to Marcus Hale. "Which part?" "All of it." Marcus Hale looked at Elena Vasquez. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that happens in a silence between people who have been through things together. Elena Vasquez looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back. The day after they classified us as harmless, Marcus Hale said. The Pale Architect withdrew the instrument of correction at hour 71, 1 hour before deadline. The official reason given, to the compact, to the conclave, to the relevant filing systems, was asterisk strategic reassessment pending revised intelligence evaluation. This was technically accurate. The Pale Architect had revised its intelligence evaluation significantly. What the revised evaluation contained, what it took 3 months and a captured fragment of the Pale Architect's private communication archive to reconstruct, was this. The Pale Architect had run the numbers on what it would cost to remove humans from the outer reach. The military numbers were manageable. The disruption numbers, infrastructure damage, navigational system restoration, communication architecture repair across every compact system that had ever had a human maintenance crew were manageable. The political numbers, the conclave attention numbers, the ripple effect across 60 years of supply chain dependency that human crews had quietly embedded themselves into, those numbers were not manageable. The Pale Architect was not afraid of humans. It had calculated, with all the precision of an empire builder who had spent decades understanding the true cost of everything, that humans were not worth removing, because removing them would cost more than leaving them. The Pale Architect thought this was a victory, a rational conclusion, an assessment of relative value. It was wrong. What the Pale Architect had calculated was the cost of removing the humans who were already there. It had not calculated, it had not even thought to calculate, what would happen when word reached every other human community in the outer reach, and in the mid-territories, and in the developing settlements that the Conclave's monitoring had logged as asterisk routine colonial expansion asterisk that Threshold had held. That they had held with 11 compromised enemy vessels and 4 engineers, and a list of names broadcast on open frequency. That they had held because of what happened when you pointed weapons at where the children were. Marcus Hale's transmission, broadcast on the same open channel as the name lists in the 47th hour, had contained 3 sentences. They were not a military broadcast. They were addressed to no specific recipient. We are not asking anyone to come. We are not promising anyone victory. We are telling you that Threshold is still here, and everyone who put a root down here decided that being here mattered more than being safe. The response traffic from human communities across the outer reach was categorized by Conclave monitoring as asterisk elevated cultural communication. What was actually happening in those communities, in those conversations, in the quiet of 100 stations and settlements where humans had been working and building and burying their dead for 60 years, was. Nobody asked them to be ready. They were already ready. Because that was what the 60 years had been for. That was what the plans formatted as history had been communicating, not tactics, not military coordination, not revolution, something older. The same thing Elena Vasquez had been communicating when she said happens and went back under the conduit. We know it costs, we do it anyway, that is what we are. The Conclave emergency session convened 4 months after Threshold. The agenda had 16 items. Every item concerned humans. The session ran for 6 days, which was 3 days longer than any Conclave emergency session in recorded history. Oreth 7 of 9 testified on the 3rd day. It had been asked to present the classification review, the analysis of what the Harmless designation had missed, why it had been applied, and what the recommended new designation should be. Oreth prepared the presentation for 6 weeks. It was thorough, comprehensive. It covered the misinterpretations in sequence, the surrenders that were not retreats, the cultural transfers that were not archives, the infrastructure dependency that ran in both directions, the maintenance access that humans treated as ownership, The 60 years that were not anomalous but were instead exactly as much time as humans apparently needed to make themselves structurally irreplaceable. On the morning of the presentation, Orath read it through from beginning to end, then set it aside. "I'll file the full analysis," Orath told the session, "but I want to start with something else. I want to start with a human named Elena Vasquez on a way station called Cathara, bleeding from her hand, telling me that injuries happen. I didn't understand that at the time. I didn't understand it for 3 years. I understand it now." The session waited. "She wasn't being dismissive," Orath said. "She wasn't being stoic. She was telling me something very precise about how humans understand their relationship to pain. She was telling me that pain is not a signal to stop. Pain is a signal that the work is real, that it matters enough to cost something." Orath set down the report. "I don't know what designation to give them. I know that harmless is wrong. I know that dangerous is also wrong because dangerous implies that the threat is the point. For humans, the threat is never the point." A pause. "They're not trying to threaten us. They're trying to exist here. They're trying to build things. They're trying to put roots down in places that will remember them." And they have. And I say this having reviewed 60 years of records that I should have reviewed 3 years ago. They have proven, repeatedly, without exception, that they will endure a staggering cost in defense of the places where their roots are. A senior counselor from the 4th tier spoke. "What are you recommending?" "I'm recommending," Orath said, "that we never again make the mistake of classifying a species based on their behavior in the moments when they've calculated that the time isn't right." "Then what do we classify them as?" Orath was quiet for a moment. In the notation file, open on a secondary screen, 3 years of private questions resolved into something that was not exactly an answer, but was the shape of one. "The Conclave has a designation for species that are physiologically overwhelming. We have a designation for species with advanced psionic capability. We have a designation for species with technological superiority." Orath looked at the session. "We have no designation for a species whose primary advantage is that they have decided, somewhere deep in their cultural architecture, in a place we cannot access or measure or predict, that certain things are worth any cost. And humans have decided this. About their families," Orath said, "about their communities, about the places they've worked and fixed and buried people in." A pause. "And I believe, I cannot prove this, but I believe, that if something sufficiently threatened the species itself, they would scale that decision to match." The session was silent. "They're not the strongest species in this galaxy," Orath said. "They're not the fastest, or the most advanced, or the most psionically capable, or the most militarily sophisticated. They are something else. They are—" The notation file was still open on the secondary screen. The last line added the morning of the testimony, "the species that does not have a stopping point. They are the only species I have encountered in 9 decades of Conclave service that does not appear to have a built-in stopping point. Every other species we've classified, everyone has a threshold, a cost at which stopping becomes rational. Humans reach that threshold and they—" Orath stopped. Started again. "They reach the point at which stopping would be rational, and they treat it as information, and then they continue anyway." The room was quiet for a long time. It was a Conclave adjudicator from the 3rd tier, a being who had not spoken in 2 days of session, who finally said what everyone in the room was thinking. "How do you fight something that treats your best argument for why it should stop as a reason to keep going?" Nobody answered. The question stayed in the room, the way certain questions do, not rhetorical, genuinely open, genuinely frightening, floating in the space where an answer should be. Threshold was still there. Humans were still on it. Elena Vasquez had taken 2 repair contracts on compact stations the previous month, stations whose previous maintenance crews had left during the instrument of correction crisis. She'd charged standard rates. She'd sent crews who showed up on time, stayed when conditions deteriorated, fix things the contracted crews had declared unfixable. The Pale architect had authorized the contracts. Marcus Hale had a new pen. The old one had been lost in the 47th hour of the threshold situation, when something had happened to the operations center that the official record described as *minor structural damage from proximity detonation, and which Marcus Hale described, in his personal log, as *the moment I stopped being surprised by anything. He didn't write much in the personal log. He wasn't a words person. But there was one entry, dated 3 days after the instrument of correction withdrew, that the Conclave's intelligence review eventually recovered, and that was subsequently, quietly, without formal attribution, included in the background materials distributed to every Conclave member species as part of the Human Classification Review. It was one line. They looked at everything we had, everything we were willing to do, everything it was going to cost, and they blinked. They always blink. We built ourselves to be the thing that makes them blink. The Conclave had 10,000 years of records, wars, extinctions, empires rising and collapsing, species that had been powerful and species that had been humble and species that had surprised everyone and species that had disappointed. 10,000 years of knowing how the story went, knowing what a civilization's limits were. Knowing, with the confidence of an institution old enough to have watched countless young species learn their place in the order of things. Knowing what a Tier 3 species, 60 years out from FTL, freshly classified as harmless, was capable of. They had been wrong. Not about the facts. The facts were all there in the records where they had always been. They had been wrong about what the facts meant. They had looked at a species that surrendered every time a Conclave vessel made a show of force, and they had seen cowardice. They had looked at a species maintaining a loss-generating economic presence on a waystation network, and they had seen desperation. They had looked at a species sending cultural transfer archives through routine filing channels, and they had seen administrative process. They had looked at Elena Vasquez bleeding under a conduit relay, saying happens, and they had seen a damaged organism performing an irrational task. What they had not seen, what had been sitting in plain sight in every data point they'd ever collected on humanity, and what Orath 7 of 9 had been circling for 3 years in a private notation file before finally nomming it, was what all of it actually was. A species doing what it had always done, since before the stars, since the first time something cold and dark and very much larger than a human being had stood between a human and what a human loved. Learning the terrain. Fixing what was broken. Staying. Not because they didn't know what it cost. Because they were the species that had decided, long before they ever left their planet, that the cost was never the question. The question was always, is this ours? And once a human answered yes, once a human had worked somewhere, fixed something, buried someone, watched a child grow up in the recycled air of a station that smelled of effort and time, the cost became asterisk information. And then they continued anyway. The Conclave reclassified humanity 6 months after the emergency session. The new designation took another 8 months to finalize, because the existing classification architecture had no category that fit, and creating a new category required consultation across 47 member species, and the consultation process kept stalling because nobody could agree on the right word. The designation they finally settled on was, by Conclave standards, extremely short. Most species designations ran to a full paragraph of qualifying descriptors. Humanity's new designation was 2 words. The first word was the standard marker, indicating that active monitoring was required at the highest tier. The second word, which had never been used in a species designation before, and which required a formal vote to add to the designation lexicon, was a word from an old Conclave language that had no precise modern equivalent. the closest translation, in any of the 112 languages used across Conclave territories, was something like *irreversible. As in, the effect of contact with them cannot be undone. As in, once they have decided something is theirs, the question of whether they will hold it is no longer meaningful. As in, do not make them decide. In Processing Chamber 9, the classification stamp that Archivist Prime Velun had pressed into the seal 9 years earlier, *Harmless, Threat Index 0.003*, was pulled from the record, physically removed, a new seal applied. The old seal was kept, filed, not destroyed. Because somewhere in the institutional memory of an organization 10,000 years old, something, not a policy, not a rule, not a formal guideline, but something, understood that this particular mistake should not be made twice. That the smell in that room on the day of the original classification had been a warning. That the galaxy had a new kind of thing in it. Not a conqueror, not a destroyer, not a chosen species or a destined power or an ascending civilization moving through predictable stages toward predictable dominance. Something older than all of that. Something that had survived ice and fire, and the casual indifference of a universe that was under no obligation to keep them alive. Something that had looked at that universe, and at everything the universe was capable of, and had decided that the most dangerous thing a species could do, the thing no rational civilization had ever been able to account for, prepare for, or outlast, was to refuse to treat stopping as an option. The Pale Architect in its private records never publicly acknowledged the threshold withdrawal. It continued operating in the outer reach. It continued encountering human maintenance crews. It continued authorizing their contracts. It did not point weapons at their habitat rings again. It did not explain why. Some things you understand not through calculation, but through the moment when calculation runs out and something more ancient takes over. The cellular memory of standing in the dark across from something that looked at your best argument and used it as fuel. The Conclave had a new word in its designation lexicon. Elena Vasquez had a new repair contract and a hand that had healed without anyone making a report about it. Marcus Hale had a new pen. Threshold had roots. And somewhere, in the cold mathematics of the universe, in the accountancy of which species endure and which species are eventually summarized in past tense in someone else's archive, something had shifted. Not toward humanity's strength. Toward the moment every other civilization eventually faced and always underestimated and never quite survived unchanged. The moment they looked across whatever distance separated them from the nearest human community and realized that the community was still there, that the lights were still on, that someone was still whistling something tuneless and information-free beneath a conduit relay, bleeding and unbothered. And understood, in the cellular dark of whatever passed for their ancient brain, that this had been going on for 60 years. And would go on.